I would like to start now. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this fourth webinar hosted by International Association for History of Religions Women's Scholars Network. And it's a pleasure for me today to introduce our guest, Catherine Wessinger. She will introduce her guests for this webinar. And I would like to start a bit with introducing myself also. I'm Milda Alisauskiene from Lithuania, from Vytautas Magnas University. And I am one of the coordinators of IAHR Women Scholars Network, together with Amy Allocco from United States. Amy will join us a bit later, and we will tell you more about our network also a bit later. As you have already heard, this is the fourth webinar. We are open for suggestions for topics for other webinars. So if you have some, please write into the chat. What would you like what kind of questions, maybe people you would like to meet during these webinars in the future. And we are delighted to see so many of you joining us today. I would also invite you to put in your name and email addresses if you would like to hear from our network in the future. So please put this information in the chat. And now I would give my word and floor to Cathy Wessinger from New Orleans. Cathy, please, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to listening to you.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here. It's really nice to see all of you here. And so today we're going to have 5 speakers, and they are the authors of the 5 books that have been published so far in the Women in Religion series at NYU Press. And you'll notice that there's a 30% discount that has been offered by NYU Press, and I put that in the chat. Also, I see at least one author, possibly 2 authors who are working on books, additional books for this Women in Religion series. Vivian Lee Nitre. Hi, Vivian. And I'm not sure, is anyone else here? Is Ori Ranke here? Okay, well, anyway, we have 5 other books forthcoming. So what I'm going to do is introduce each author one by one very briefly, and we'll each take 7 minutes to talk about our books. And then after that, we'll have general discussions. So Barbara Ambros is first, and she is professor of East Asian religions at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And her book is titled Women in Japanese Religions.
Thank you, Cathy. I'm excited to be here, and I would like to thank Cathy and Milda and my panelists for making this possible. It's a real joy to be on this panel with all of you. So I have some slides I want to share with you about the book, so it's easier to follow what I'm talking about. So let me share my slide presentation. Let me know if you cannot see it properly or if there are any issues. Just unmute yourself and tell me, because it's a little bit hard for me to monitor the chat while I'm speaking. So my book is titled Women in Japanese Religions. And when I was asked to write this volume, this presented me with really quite a number of challenges, because the Japanese religious landscape is diverse and very interconnected, particularly in the pre-modern period. And when I envisioned this project, I really wanted to capture some things that I deeply care about. One is historical change and class differences, because I didn't want to come out with a very flat image of women in Japanese religions that was stuck in a particular period and did not recognize some differences between different classes, for instance. So what I chose to do is first of all, I forgot to mention this. There's a webpage on the NYU website for the book. And I'm not showing this to you because I want to sell my book, but in the lower right-hand corner, there's an instructor's guide. And you can download this instructor's guide if you want to teach with this book in your classroom. And when you download the instructor's guide, let me see if I can get out of this. Okay. You'll see on one of the first pages that there's a table of contents, so you can see what's actually in the book, and that gives you an idea how I organized it. And what I decided to do was do a historical survey. Now, that means ultimately that I perhaps scratched the surface of a lot of topics, but on the other hand, it really allowed me to capture that historical change by looking at the longue durée. And that was really what I was interested in, because very often when women are talked about in Japanese religions, there are certain kind of aspects that are seen as kind of rigid and unchanging. And I really wanted to speak against this. And what I also wanted to do is to provide, in a sense, a complementary or even a counter narrative to established narratives about Japanese religions, which tend to prioritize, say, important thinkers, which tend to be largely male thinkers. And they're also very sectarian, and that often doesn't do justice to the way that things actually worked in Japanese religions. And what was really interesting to me is that a number of colleagues have told me that they're using this book as the textbook for their Japanese religions course. So all of a sudden, it has completely changed the way that students are introduced to Japanese religions and providing a very different narrative to what they wouldn't previously get. And that made me actually really, really happy. And in the book, I really try to deal very equitably with different periods of Japanese religions and different modes of Japanese religions. So you won't just learn something about Buddhism, you'll learn something about the prehistoric period and archaeological finds. You'll hear things about Shinto and Buddhism, about popular religion, about new religions, and developments and prehistory, developments during the present day. But I've tried to make this accessible to a wide audience. And those of you who want to teach with this book, the way that when I was writing the book, I was actually teaching classes on the topic myself. So I took note on what the students needed to know in order to grasp some of the content. I tried to work this in the book, and I've also shared some of the discussion questions that I asked my students on the guide. So you can see in the instructor's guide study questions that you can use for your students. And also there are some additional resources listed. Those are primary sources that I've often used to assign with the reading so that the students can actually engage with some primary sources and try to make something of the readings of these primary sources in light of what they've learned from the book. So I think my time is probably up. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
My name is Rebecca Moore, and I am the author of Women in Christian Traditions. And I echo Barbara Ambros' thanks to the organizers of this webinar, the Women Scholars Network of IAHR, and also to Catherine Wessinger. And it's really difficult to go first, but after Barbara's presentation, I can tell you it's much more difficult to go second, because all I can say is what she said, except we say Christianity and Christian traditions rather than Japanese religions and Japanese traditions. So I wanted to talk about methodology, gender issues, and then the instructor's guide, which Barbara has done in detail for Japanese religions. And so this will be a little repetitive. So I'll put that on the screen in a moment. In terms of methodology, the books are really aimed at college and university students. So we always had to keep that in mind and write accordingly as we were approaching this subject. Like Barbara, I took a historical approach, and covered topics chronologically, trying to locate women in their social and historical contexts and not just kind of keep them out in the ether, but that they were responding to particular historical moments in their religious outlook. I also tried to aim for geographical diversity, Christian women in Western Europe, in the Eastern Empire, in the Southern Hemisphere, in Asia. I had the misfortune recently to read a review that said, well, it was fine, except she didn't really deal with the Southern Hemisphere. And that was a limitation, I think, of all of our books, is like, are we comprehensive or are we selective? And in what ways are we selective? So that was always a balance, trying to be as comprehensive as possible and yet stay within, 200 pages. I also tried to avoid the great woman approach by addressing themes thematically and introducing women who exemplified those themes. So rather than get the most famous women, of course I did do the Virgin Mary, but we also have to balance her with Mary Magdalene. So for example, if I'm talking about Christian missions, I could talk about missionaries, which I did, but I also talked about natives, for example, Kateri Tekakwitha, in terms of Native American spirituality and its relationship to Christianity. In terms of gender analysis, I began the book by introducing the major feminist Christian theological analyses: reformist, reconstructionist, and rejectionists. The reformists think that, Christianity can be saved, just kind of read the Bible right and tweak it a little and you'll be fine. The reconstructionists think, no, it needs radical revision from top to bottom. And the rejectionists, as you can imagine, said, it's hopelessly patriarchal, we're out of here. So what I did throughout the rest of the book after establishing those approaches was look at how women resisted patriarchal control, either overtly or covertly. So for example, the Beguines in the Low Countries formed their own communal societies. Young women could join and be protected, and yet they could leave and get married. On the other hand, there were orders of women religious who were constrained by the Catholic hierarchy and yet practiced teaching and even preaching outside the cloister. So women resisted patriarchy in a number of different ways. In addition to gender issues, I also tried to address race and class, and most notably, one example would be the fact that the Women's Christian Temperance Union had racially segregated chapters in the American South. And actually, Ida B. Wells, who's a notable African-American journalist, called out the WCTU on their racism. And finally, share screen. There we go. Again, like Barbara, I'm not trying to sell the book. I just wanted you to see the instructor's guide. And like Barbara, it gives a chapter by chapter presentation. It basically gives a summary of what the book, what each chapter is about. So if the instructor is pinched for time, she or he can take a quick peek. Discussion questions for each chapter. And then just to kind of cruise down a little bit further, I provided extensive bibliographic. And this was a way to enlarge the book. So I could include websites, I could have primary sources that I used. I have secondary sources that didn't make it into the book, right? But these would be useful to people who want to study bibliographies, websites, and so on. Of course, the danger of using websites is that they go offline. But the benefit is that instructors can use primary sources, either print or digital, and to enhance the book. So I really recommend looking at the instructor's guide, because it really just kind of makes life easier and kind of gives you insight into the mind of the author. I think that's it. And thanks for listening, and enjoy. I look forward to our discussion in a bit.
Thank you, Rebecca. So next is Laura Vance, and she's professor of sociology at Brevard College, and her book is titled Women in New Religions.
Thanks again to the organizers and to all of you for being here. I've always been fascinated by the interplay between gender and religion, and I was very excited when Kathy asked me to participate in developing a book for this series. My book is Women in New Religions. As a teacher, one of the reasons I'm really excited about this series is that I've always searched for texts that delve deeply into gender and diverse religions in a way that really centers and integrates both and explores the connections between the two, while also drawing from contemporary theories, especially theories in gender and sexuality studies, sociology of religion, and religious studies. And my purpose in Women in New Religions is to provide a book that does that, but also really engages and is accessible to students. I spent a large portion of my life, to some extent, preparing to write this book. The research methods that are employed in developing the substantive chapters of the book were based on, or the research methods include research through interviews and surveys, extensive participant observation, and primary and secondary source materials. And I, like Rebecca, I included those in my bibliography. So Women in New Religions forms a theoretical analysis of gender that really incorporates ideas that are multidisciplinary, including ideas from Irving Goffman about the ways in which we embed gender in everyday life, from Weston Zimmerman about doing gender through interactions, from Judith Butler about gender performance and gender regulation through structured cultural discourses, and from Francine Douche, who really raises interesting questions about resisting and undoing and restructuring gender. And I also incorporate questions about intersectionality and social inequalities into the book, drawing, of course, from Kimberly Crenshaw. As others have noted, gender varies greatly across time. We were all given a page limit, a fairly strict page limit for the books, and we all had to probably make really difficult decisions about what to develop and the kind of depth that we could develop, the depth of development for each of the topics that we explored. But the interesting thing, hopefully, about this book is that it explores, I think, in some good depth, 4 religions. It looks at Mormonism. Mormonism, of course, coalesced around a young charismatic leader whose theology focused on polygamous sexual expression and family structures on earth and in the eternities. And that religious leader, Joseph Smith, developed teachings that expanded women's opportunities far beyond what was typical in 19th century America. And those expanded opportunities continued for women in the decades beyond his death, but then were, by the 20th century, significantly limited. And so, like other authors, I develop an historical examination of gender within each of the religions that I look at. And I also try to compare and contrast the religions and the experiences of women in each. Mormonism is interesting because by the 20th century, and certainly even today, the church and church leaders have promoted a narrow vision of women as wives and homemakers to the exclusion of their participation in other activities. Another religion that I explore in the book is Seventh-day Adventism, which emerged around a teenage girl who was disappointed in the middle of the 19th century by the failure of Christ to return to earth. Ellen White developed a religion as a prophet that allowed women to minister, but today the church is really split over the question of women's ordination and is poised even for the possibility of a global divide on that question. The other religions explored in the book include the Family International, a religion that's been called many things, founded by David Berg, who incorporated unusual sexual practices and living arrangements that are of interest to students. And the last religion example included in the book is Wicca, which many students have familiarity with, at least in terms of popular media depictions. And my students have found the discussion of Wicca to be fascinating. They have, again, at least some popular familiarity with that book. Religion, it's a site of ultimate meaning, and since it's a social institution through which meaning is explicitly connected to the divine, it plays often a key role in forming and shaping definitions and lived practices of gender and sexuality. And because of that, religion and gender form an incredibly important nexus for examination of religions. And I would argue this is particularly true of emerging and new religions, religions that are in the process of originating and emerging, because those potentially offer a more defined and an especially useful site for examination of the ways in which institutions and leaders and individual believers internalize, navigate, negotiate, resist, contest, and transform gender. And so, like Barbara and Rebecca, I do try to take a more complicated view of gender. I try to take into account the geographical variations, the historical variations that we see in terms of gender, and to situate those in each of the 4 religions. Again, the book is relatively short, and it's intended to be used over a short period of time in a class. It could be used on its own or in conjunction with other texts. And I'm not going to pull up my resources. They're very similar to those that Barbara and Rebecca have shared, but I include numerous primary and secondary source materials, films, online resources, and I've also developed an instructor's guide that provides a fairly hopefully provocative list of questions to stimulate discussions on each of the chapters. And I will turn things over to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Laura. So the next presenter is Karma Lekshe Tsomo. She's professor of theology and religious studies at University of San Diego. Her book is titled Women in Buddhist Traditions. And Lekshe, you just tell me when you want me to share screen, okay?
Okay, why don't you do that now, just to
Okay.
show the cover and whatever you have, and then I'm going to show some slides as well. So like the other authors, when Kathy asked me to write this book, I thought it would be a piece of cake because I've been engaging with these traditions for, well, more than 50 years, since I was a kid, basically. But when I got into it, about 10 years ago, I realized that more than 300 publications had come out in the meantime, and I needed to catch up with all the latest research. By now, it's far more. And so I had so much material to deal with. And the diversity of Buddhism is really staggering, because we are looking at 2,500 years of development, religious development, in many different countries, speaking many different languages, many different philosophical traditions, and women's roles in these traditions has, on top of it, changed over time. Short example of the differences, the variety. Of course, I had to begin at the beginning, which was with the birth of the young prince who later became the Buddha. And I argue that, women have been vitally important from the beginning, because without Mother Maya, there would have been no baby, Siddhartha, and then there would have been no Buddhism. So women figure significantly at every stage of the Buddha's journey. His stepmother became the first Buddhist nun. There were thousands of liberated women. Women were vital in taking the tradition to different parts of the world, like Sri Lanka. They have been upholders of the tradition from the beginning, but their roles have often been overlooked. In the beginning, we have the poems of the first Buddhist elder nuns, but then women sort of drop out of Buddhist history for hundreds of years and reappear in the last, especially in the last 33 years since we began an international Buddhist women's movement. So the book traces the histories and developments that women have been central in fashioning over the last, since 1987. But from the beginning in each country, because women's roles were often as supporters, though we do have archetypes of liberated, awakened women in some traditions. On the other hand, literacy has been pretty much in the hands of males who learned in monastic centers that were completely closed to women. So now everything is changing, and this makes the field extremely interesting. Many breakthroughs and just in the last few years that are changing everything. The ordination issue is still central and vitally important and unresolved, though we are in dialogue with leaders in the different Buddhist traditions, and the future looks bright. So this is the logo of Sakya to the International Association of Buddhist Women, who, you know, we've sort of been ringleaders in trying to make changes. And so that's part of the story. So I try to tell the stories of women in the different countries and keep the historical timeline. Of course, it's been fascinating uncovering some of these amazing stories and highlighting the lives of Buddhist women in these different traditions. I can imagine it's a bit overwhelming for students and instructors, but at least now we have something to go by, bringing it all together and then setting them side by side. We can make some comparative analysis between the different traditions and trying to trace patterns of similarity and the uniqueness of all these different traditions. So did you have more to show on that, Kathy?
For you, Lekshe's table of contents, okay, which is basically what she just went over. So do you have anything else you want to add, Lekshe?
I think that's it. Yeah,
Okay.
I used the manuscript in my course on women in Buddhism in fall 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very helpful for seeing the students' responses and also addressing some of their questions, some of which I was able to incorporate in the final manuscript. So it's been a joy. It's also been extremely challenging.
Yeah.
But I hope it will be helpful to people teaching women in religion, women in Buddhism. And thank you very much, Kathy, for this endeavor. It's been a labor of love, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Lekshe. Okay, so I'm Catherine Wessinger, and I'm professor of the history of religions at Loyola University in New Orleans. And here's the webpage for my book, Theory of Women in Religions. I see a question about the year of publication for these books. The first three books, the ones by Barbara Ambros, Rebecca Moore, and Laura Vance, they were published in 2015. The last two books by Lekshe Tsomo and myself were published this December 2020. So, so my book, Theory of Women in Religions, is an introduction to the study of women in religions. I use it at the beginning of my Women in Religions course. In this book, I take an interdisciplinary approach. I draw heavily on gender analysis produced by anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists, historians, and scholars working in the area of psychology. And I integrate that gender analysis with a history of religions approach to the study of women in religions. My primary questions while researching and writing the book were, what is the origin of patriarchy? What are the factors that contribute to the development of male dominance and different expressions of patriarchy? What are the factors that contribute to increased equality for girls and women in society and therefore in religions? I also ask, do gender roles in society contribute to characteristics of religions? Or do specific characteristics of religions shape gender roles in families and societies? So you can see the table of contents here. This is from the instructor's guide that is on the webpage for my book. So the introduction is titled Why Study Women in Religions. Then chapter 1 is on foundations, methodology, and relevant terms. Chapter 2 is devoted to what I call the economic theory of the emergence and transformation of patriarchy. Chapter 3 is focused on psychological theories of gender roles and women's self-esteem. Chapter 4 examines issues for women in religions, and then there is the conclusion. In my reading, I found that the origin of patriarchy is located in prehistory. In the historical periods of various cultures, male dominance typically is already entrenched. This is why I rely heavily on the scholarship of anthropologists who have studied living cultures, and also the analysis of archaeologists who emphasize that developmental changes occur within societies as technologies and gender roles change. Drawing on the analysis produced by anthropologists, specifically Ernestine Friedel, who is the author of Women and Men, an Anthropologist's View, my book presents what I call the economic theory of the emergence and transformation of patriarchy. According to the economic theory, technologies by which humans feed themselves and their families shape different economies and their respective developmental patterns of societies. The available technologies and resulting economies shape the ways that women and men divide the labor that is needed to provide for family members. The ways that women and men divide labor shape gender roles, which are reinforced in culture and specifically in religions. My thesis is that in societies in which women are regarded as being economically productive by their direct production of primary resources to feed and care for family members, the corresponding religions will have stories, myths, rites of passage, and theologies that express respect for women and their contributions. Women in these societies play active roles in creating the stories, myths, theologies, and rites of passage that express for women and that daughters are valued. Conversely, societies in which women are removed from direct production of economic resources for survival, and in which women's work consists solely of processing primary products such as crops into secondary products that can be consumed or used by their family members, women are not regarded by the men as being economically productive. Families and society are male dominated, and the devaluing and control of girls and women will be emphasized in the religion's myths, theologies, rites of passage, and other rituals and law codes. After patriarchy has existed for thousands of years, even after technologies and economies change and distinct gender roles begin to break down, and there is increased education and women have increased access to economic earning power, religious traditions are frequently conservative factors in continuing to reinforce patriarchal gender roles. Nevertheless, economic empowerment and education are key to promoting equality for girls and women in families, societies, and their religions. The psychology chapter considers several psychological theories concerning binary and non-binary gender roles, in addition to feminist Gloria Steinem's emphasis on the need for a revolution from within to promote the self-esteem of girls and women to accompany the revolution in society toward increased equality. This chapter encourages students to consider how religions may diminish or support the self-esteem of girls and women. Chapter 4 highlights 11 issues to examine to discern the status of girls and women in specific religions and cultures. Each of the 11 issues may have positive or negative religious manifestations in religions that impact the well-being of girls and women. This chapter, as well as other chapters in the book, describe numerous examples to illustrate the status of girls and women in religious cultures, the challenges to their well-being and equality, and how girls and women are addressing these challenges. My instructor's guide, available on the NYU Press webpage for the book, provides a synopsis and discussion questions for each chapter. This summer, I'll be working on an additional resources bibliography to add to the instructor's guide for my book. And before we open it up for general questions, I want to note that I saw a couple of other authors of forthcoming books in this series are present. I saw Oriaranke. Oriaranke, are you here? She was here.
Please.
Yes, okay, so there's Oriaranke. She has a book forthcoming on women in Yoruba religions. And let's see, Neelama Shukla Bhatt was here earlier. Are you here, Neelama?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so
Hello, everyone. Fascinating discussion. Thank you.
great, glad you could be here. So she's working on a manuscript on women in Hindu traditions or women in Hindu religions. So do you have any questions for any of us individually?
Kathy, I saw that there is one question to Professor Laura Vance.
Yeah, I see that question as well, and I'd be happy to speak to that. So Seventh-day Adventism, interestingly, has been incredibly successful in terms of its global growth. Not many people realize that Mormonism actually is now overshadowed worldwide by Seventh-day Adventism. It has more members internationally. It has really large and growing membership. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church is very much divided between the way in which gender is practiced and encouraged in the developed or overdeveloped world and in other parts of the world. So the United States and especially Western European countries strongly favor and in some instances, in opposition to church-wide policies, allow women's ordination. But in other parts of the world, women's ordination is really seen as antithetical to the teachings of the church. They haven't officially split, but the question is as perennial and difficult for the movement as a whole. And it is a very patriarchal church in some parts of the world. But in other parts of the world, I think, for example, of a conference in Southern California that even elected a woman as its president. In other parts of the world, it's really progressive in terms of the ways in which women are allowed to be ordained and perform rituals. And hopefully that answers that question.
Great. And yes, I did introduce Vivian Lee Nitre at the beginning of the session, but Vivian, there you are. She's also working on a book in the series on women in Chinese religions. Thanks. Okay, any other questions?
I see one more question from Ludmila.
Okay, so the question is, does it not seem to scholars that the so-called Western religions are closed to women in contrast to the so-called Eastern religions? How can this be explained? No, I don't think so. I do a lot of comparative study and teaching about women in religions, and I think others will want to comment also. But it's my observation that scriptures are diverse, religious traditions are diverse, and I, as you can tell from the thesis that I articulated earlier, I think once socioeconomic conditions are conducive to promoting women, a greater equality for women, if not complete equality for women, because we've still got a long way to go. But when socioeconomic conditions are conducive, women have greater leeway to draw on the resources of their own religious traditions, if they want to stay in their traditions, to promote women's equality and leadership in their traditions. So, you know, Rosemary Radford Ruther, when she was writing about Christianity, she said that, you know, the very large, diverse Christian tradition contains resources to promote, that can be used to promote women's equality, or she used the term equivalence, but I like the word equality. Okay, so so the tradition contains resources that can be used to promote women's equality, but it also contains plenty of resources that can be used to promote women's subordination. So the socioeconomic conditions are going to determine, and also individual choices will determine what types of resources will be highlighted. But how about the rest of you, Barbara?
I think it's an interesting question, but I think the question also revealed something about our assumptions. Because I often find in working on Japanese religions that my students, for instance, bring two different points of view to the material. There's some who think that, for instance, the Buddhist tradition or East Asian religions will offer them an alternative to what they've got in their own backyard. And then they are outraged that that's not the case, that they run into the same kind of issues that they run into in their own traditions, for instance. Or there are those who come in and just assume from the get-go that if we're dealing with anything non-Western, that women must always be subordinate, that everything is completely patriarchal, and that we can never look at it as a glass half full. And I think ultimately the answers are always far more complex. You will find opportunities and challenges within any religious tradition. And also traditions change over time, responding to the people that actually constitute those traditions. And sometimes, and that's something that I really tried to pay attention to in my book, I wasn't just interested in women who subverted patriarchy. I was also wanted to know, why is it that women sometimes actually engage with it and support it and use it for their own advantage? What is it that makes them tick? That's kind of what I wanted to know. And sometimes that's really hard to do. The thing that I, for instance, struggled with, I think the most difficult issue for me, and out of all the issues that I dealt with in my book, is what to do with a popular Buddhist scripture called the Blood Pool Hell Sutra. How that tells women, ultimately in the Japanese context, in the Chinese context, it was appropriated a little bit differently. It was more about parturitive blood, so bloodshed and childbirth. In the Japanese context, it ends up being about menstruation. So just because you're a woman and you're menstruating, you're gonna go to hell. What do I do with this text? Why is it that women were interested in this text? Why did they form sororities that spent time on reciting this text? What is it that they thought they would get out of it for doing this? That to me was the interesting question, not whether or not that can be salvaged or not, but I was really interested in why they were doing it. So that's, I think ultimately it's a really complex issue of whether or not a tradition is welcoming women. I think they all do in a certain extent, and so they all don't in a certain extent, or many of them don't. That's just my 2 cents.
I think that very clearly points out the influences of indigenous attitudes and perspectives on the different religions that are accepted. For example, I mean, Buddhism originated in India. There were no pollution taboos that we can document about blood and menstruation and all of that. And this Blood Pool Sutra was written in China and somehow ascribed to Buddhism. So it's really interesting how external factors can change the attitudes of, or maybe external factors, maybe we should say indigenous beliefs and practices can affect religious traditions, and sometimes in positive ways and sometimes in unhealthy ways. But why it took off, I'm really glad that I mean, we get so tired of hearing about the sutra, which is such an anomaly. And it's come to take center stage in discussions about women in Buddhism when it's really peripheral and not even present in most of the traditions, only in East Asia and in certain parts of East Asia. So it's a very interesting question. And how do we trace all of these different influences? It becomes very complex. Yeah.
All right. Rebecca or Laura, do you want to comment on that question before we move on?
I'll just make one quick comment regarding in Christian tradition, in Christianity, a large part of it relates to who's the keeper of the sacred text and who is the interpreter. And once literacy became widespread and women could actually read the texts, the things changed, or at least women could challenge things scripturally in a way that they could not before the advent of widespread literacy. So not all traditions are so text-based. That's one answer. And then the other part is the claim of the Holy Spirit. In other words, extra textual sources of authority are also empowering. And again, I can't speak to non-Christian traditions, but certainly in Christianity, the influence of the Holy Spirit basically breaks all the rules. And so within the tradition itself, there are elements that allow for its own subversion.
Okay. Laura, do you want to comment?
I can, sure. In terms of the movements that I looked at, some of them are global movements. And so I really wasn't trying to make that particular distinction, but to really look at the complexities of the ways in which they varied geographically and historically.
All right. Well, thanks. I'm here looking up Bachofen because obviously he's someone who I dismissed early on, and I'll tell you why. Basically, the anthropologists that I've read are agreed that there's no such thing as matriarchy as in the sense of being the opposite of patriarchy, male dominance and the subordination of women. And instead, what you find in the world are matrilineal societies where inheritance and family lineage is traced through the mother. Some of these societies are matrilocal, which means the husband moves in with the family or the band or the tribe of the woman, the extended family of the woman. And so in my book, I'm following the anthropologists who use the terms matrilineal, matrilocal, and I make a statement in my book that, again, based on the anthropologists I've read, that there is no matriarchy. Now, there are scholars who have redefined the word matriarchy to mean what I just referred to, because in matrilineal and matrilocal societies, you don't have women dominating men. You have women have greater importance. Women have, obviously, they're very, very important to the family. Very often they're making important economic contributions to the family. But in matrilineal and matrilocal societies, you still have men in positions of leadership. If a man is the head of the family, it's going to be the uncle, not the father, okay? Or you will have men in positions of political leadership, although the women will have a good bit of say about which men are selected and the decisions that they make. Or very often men go into positions of religious leadership. So, and I think women have a lot of advantages in matrilineal and matrilocal societies, but they would be more partnership societies. And I think it's a shift. Well, it's really hard to tell because there are plenty of, in my book, Theory of Women and Religions, I talk about gender roles in foraging, or in other words, hunting and gathering societies. You know, there are hunting and gathering societies that are patrilineal and patrilocal, and they're on their way toward male dominance, okay? But the ones I have been interested in are the matrilineal and the matrilocal ones. And so I draw on a good bit of examples, or a good many examples from the Apache before they were subjected to colonialism. So in the indigenous Apache religion, you know, they have a rite of passage for girls, a puberty rite of passage for girls. She's identified with an important foremother goddess, white painted woman. And they have managed to retain that emphasis on the importance of girls and women in their society, even to the present time. From my reading in anthropology and archaeology, a key issue is when you have the transition to intensive agriculture. The stage before that is horticulture. And certainly there are horticultural societies where the men own the land and pass it down to their sons, okay? But you can still find a few horticultural societies, you know, where you're farming using a hoe, a stick or a hoe, that are matrilineal and matrilocal, and women have a higher standing in those societies. But once you get to the point where you have plow agriculture or intensive agriculture, farming with a plow, pulled with a large draft animal, and it takes a lot of coordinated work of men as opposed to coordinated work of women to farm the land, that's where you begin to get a transition to a very intensive form of patriarchy that I call classical patriarchy, where you know, inheritance is through the men own the land, the women have to move into their husbands' families when they get married. Now, of course, there's always diversity, you know, human beings, the ways that humans organize themselves into families and societies, there's always diversity. So I was talking about, for instance, India, where you know, it's very patrilineal, very patrilocal, and it's hierarchical, you know, class stratification and so forth. And then I say, well, that goes back to men taking control of the farming due to what I'm calling plow agriculture. And of course, I had a student who was Indian American student, and she goes, my grandmother back in India still plows the land. Okay, so, you know, and I'm going, she's a very smart grandmother, because she knows that that's the way to maintain her control over the land and her status and relation as being the landowner. So one of the rules of thumb that I talk about in the book is always expect diversity. But no, I spend a good bit of time not addressing Bachofen, but the invasion theory promoted by Maria Gimbutas. And I won't go into that now, but in the book I give reasons for why that's not a very good explanation for the origin of patriarchy. Neelima, do you have a question?
I put my question in the chat box, and it was about how you all handled such long histories and so much diversity in a limited, like within your page limit. Because dealing with Hinduism, I will be dealing with the same issues with so much complexity. So I just wanted to know how you approached it and what strategies you found most helpful.
And there's another question that is very similar to Neelima's that jumps off on that from Sophie. Maybe those could be answered in tandem.
Okay, what is Sophie's
Painful
question?
decision.
Sophie says, I have a similar question as Neelima. I'm interested in methodology. How do you bridge history, tradition, and living practices and roles? What was your main approach to present a woman in particular religion?
Some painful decisions about what to leave out, I think, is one strategy. Limiting the topics that you cover. For me, it was picking certain topics and tracing them through history, allowing, though, for some dead ends, things that are important during only particular time periods, and they may drop off in other time periods as well, but really making difficult decisions, I think. And for me, I was always interested in, I'm interested not necessarily just in political history, history is not just about politics. You can also have social history, and then you get into lived tradition. So going from kind of social history to a more ethnographic approach in the later chapters was actually not that different, because I'm looking at similar kind of topics. So I think that would be what I would say to that.
I think to echo that, I'm so aware of everything that's left out. I mean, it's kind of bigger than the book itself, what didn't make it in. And yet there's a discipline to trying to say what's important in a short amount of space. And so it's trying to figure out what is like truly essential or advances the plot. You know, there might be some things that advance the narrative that may or may not be as central as, you know, other people tell the story. Because I like, because remember our audience for this particular book is educated readers, but primarily students. And how do we tell the story of these traditions, how people or how women actually practiced their religion, what was important to them? I think those are the things that kind of at least helped guide me. And then of course, things that I had not known about and learned about in my research that I thought, wow, I didn't know like that women were bone pickers in the era of martyrdom, and they're the ones who financed the shrines, and they're the ones who made martyrs, not just by being martyrs, but by writing about them, by elevating their bones and so on. So there's like kind of this balance between, well, what's the big picture, but what are those like little details that make it come alive to readers?
And if I just may add, when I was writing the book and was telling people about what it was like to write it, I always said it was like writing a sestina, because you had a sort of meter that you were going by, you had certain kind of rhymes, and that gave you a pattern, and you just had to make it fit, and that was what made it powerful and a coherent narrative. But there are certain things you just couldn't do. So
thank you so much.
And I think, you know, for the authors who published their books first in 2015, I think the limitation on the size of the book was a big motivation to produce these very long bibliographies of additional readings. So believe me, everything else that you could possibly use in a course, they have in their bibliographies. And I'll also say that, well, Rebecca Moore and I co-edit a portion of an online encyclopedia called Women in World Religions and Spirituality Project. And so they contain, you know, those profiles, thematic essays we're adding to that all the time. And we encourage scholars to get in touch with us to submit proposals for a proposal on a particular, or submit a proposal on to write a profile on a particular woman or women's roles in a particular movement. So what I've been teaching women in Christianity lately using Rebecca's book, and then I'm adding, you know, other texts, including profiles from the Women in World Religions and Spirituality Project. I also have used chapters from Laura Vance's book in my Women in Religions course, and I'm using chapters from Oryaranke's forthcoming chapters on women in Yoruba religions. The books were deliberately limited in size so that they could be used in a variety of ways.
Yes, I understand. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I would just really echo what Kathy said. I think, you know, we talk about the complexity of these within these traditions, and this kind of, you know, this not just the notion of the historical development and the social context, but also the kind of you know, the socialization seeks as its end goal to inculcate the individual into particular ideas about gender and religion, but the individual can respond to those and resist and modify, and the complexity of that really is difficult, but the primary source resources are really a nice tool for students, where they can actually go in and read some of the original texts of the movements. And it's there are ways in which that complexity is embedded with the books, even though it's not all laid out bare on the page.
And if I could just add one more thing in answer to Sophie's question about how do you bridge history, tradition, and living practices roles. Well, of course, you know, in my approach, it's very historical, but I'm also paying a lot of attention to current events, you know, news stories about current events. And I bring those into the book and I bring those into the class along with movies. And my introduction includes a lot of case studies summarized in the introduction to show students that in the present time, women are not equal in their various religious traditions. Women continue to have struggles. And I do this on purpose because I know when I was a college student, I went into university, it never occurred to me that I was unequal in society. And of course, I awakened to that as I grew older. But so I just presume that college students, especially the women, don't assume that women have an unequal status. Although I find today's college students to be pretty well educated in terms of gender matters.
We have a question from Florence regarding the forthcoming series.
Go ahead.
I'm just wondering if you will have more volumes that would be focused on specific topics rather than on religions or areas like myth, women and religion, or ritual, women and religion, territories, women and religion, and so on. And if you have plans for a more key topics based approach or something like that. And I want to thank you for this series. It's extremely useful in structuring courses for undergraduates.
Thank you. And the answer is no, not at the present time. My book, Theory of Women and Religions, addresses some of that, okay? But right now we're focused on trying to cover some of the religious traditions of the world. Certainly there are others I'm hoping that we'll be able to add in the future to the project. And at this point in time, I don't think the press is, actually the press wants us to finish the books that are in process, and then I think we'll see what else can be added in the future. Okay.
Although I would add to that I think a lot of those topics actually are addressed in the individual books.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think there is a following question by Donna. She's asking whether there will be some time in the future book on women and religion spirituality in indigenous traditions. What do you think? What
Well,
would you say?
Oriranke's book is forthcoming on Yoruba indigenous religious tradition. I had hoped to have a book in the series on a Native American indigenous tradition. It didn't work out, unfortunately, but I certainly, you know, I wanted it to be there. So we will have to keep that in mind and continue looking. Yes.
I'm now approaching all the people who are with us today. If you have questions, you can put in your chat them, and if we don't receive questions, I would ask all our presenters today to say something for closing this discussion. What do you think we have learned, and what we need to learn in the future regarding women in religions?
Who would like to go first?
Get it over with. It's so nice to be with all of you today, and the questions were great, and I enjoyed the discussion. I just think, you know, the topic is huge. It's endlessly fascinating, and each of us has our own little tiny piece of this enormous body of research and study. And so I'm glad that all of us are engaged in this work, because it really takes all of us to get it done. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well said.
I also want to echo Rebecca's comment. Thank you all for the interesting questions, and to all the participants. I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to be part of this panel, but also to write this book. I learned a great deal from researching the book, discovered things that I didn't know about previously, and things that changed over time that I wasn't aware of. And one thing that I just wanted to share with you, which was very interesting. So when I was writing this book, I was submitting grant applications at various places, so fellowship applications. And I did a grant writing workshop, and I circulated my proposal. And in that proposal, I thanked the Japanese scholars who had done a lot of groundwork on these topics, and that I felt very much indebted to them. And something really interesting happened. The people who are reading my manuscript are largely, or that proposal, were largely a bunch of guys. And all of them jumped on this sentence and told me to take it out because it would make me sound weak. And I was really furious because I was indebted to the Japanese scholars who'd done a lot of research, and a lot of other scholars from other places in the world who'd done a lot of research. And I wasn't supposed to thank them and tell them that I was indebted to their research. I was really flabbergasted by that. So this is just to echo Kathy's comment that things persist to this day. But thank you all for being here. It was a really great pleasure to be part of this.
It really has been a pleasure to participate in this project, and I really appreciate people who've attended today. Barbara, that experience just hits home again, this notion about not just how important the examination of gender is, but religion, even though it's a topic that doesn't always get much funding in education, is a topic, religion is connected to the divine. It connects us to the divine, and gender, because it's so embedded in everything that we do. This kind of series that really is focusing it so intensely on those two things and how they come together. I just really hope that it's as useful for people as possible.
I think when I was working on the book, I found that one of the biggest constraints is that hundreds of years of Buddhist history has no mention of women at all. So what we're engaged in researching and uncovering the stories and contributions of women is incredibly significant historically. So one of the greatest contributions of this series is knowledge production. And we are active participants in this, like by encouraging women in Malaysia to uncover their own Buddhist history, or Mongolia, or Buryatia, or another part of the world. We are creating history. We're bringing to light contributions of women that have been overlooked and underplayed and denigrated, even in many cases. And how research is done sort of determines the end product. So when women are involved and asking different questions, it's extremely important and valuable and exciting. So thank you all.
Yes, and I want to thank again all of you for being here, and also I want to thank the authors who have already published in the series, and also the authors who are currently writing their manuscripts. One of the joys of being an editor is you get to learn from so many different experts, and that's been the process. And several of you have had direct input into my own book, and I really appreciate that a lot, as well as the anonymous readers, whoever they are. I appreciate their input as well. So this is a large undertaking, but it's an exciting undertaking, the study of women and gender in religions. I find that students are very engaged with the topic. Of course, women students are engaged with it, but the young men are also engaged with it, and And so I think this is a topic that is of inherent interest to students. And so I hope that this series will make a contribution to more teaching about women and gender and religions ongoingly. And also, I look forward to learning from all of you about your own work and what you're doing. Thank you. And thank you for sponsoring us today. So thanks.
Thank you all our presenters for these very interesting insights. And I believe we all understand that we have too little knowledge about religion if we do not know how women are in those religions, how they are acting, what are their agencies in those religions. We actually miss the whole picture of religion if we miss women in that picture. And I believe that you have been working so far and produced a very useful tool for all of us, for our future scholarship and also for our teaching in the universities and to our students. So thank you all, and thank you for this discussion. And I would like to remind everyone who today was here with us that you have been attending the International Association for History of Religions Women Scholars Network 4th webinar. And I am the moderator of Women Scholars Network together with Amy Allocco. And it was our pleasure to have today Catherine Wessinger and her team, I would say, in this book series on women in religions. And please follow us on the IAHR website and also in Facebook about our future webinars. So much for today. Thank you all and have a nice day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.